それでは時間になりましたので、始めさせていただきます。本日の講演会は日英同時通訳で、行います。お手元の同時通訳機器のチャンネル1が日本語、チャンネル2が英語でございます。Well, okay, let's get started. Thank you very much for gathering here this afternoon. In about a minute, we're going to start a public lecture featuring Mr. Eliot Abrams, the Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Today's lecture is served with a simultaneous translation between English and Japanese. For those who have wireless transmission receiver, the channel 1 is for Japanese and the channel 2 is for English. So please tune in to the channel of your choice accordingly. 皆様、本日は米国外交問題評議会Council on Foreign Relations シニアフェローエリオット・エイブラムス氏を迎えての講演会2016年米国大統領選挙と米国内政外交の展望にご参加いただき誠にありがとうございます。私は本日の講演会主催者の一員である国際交流基金日米センター所長の茶野純一と申します。私ども国際交流基金は1972年に創設された外務省所管の政府の独立行政法人ですが、設置基本法である国際交流基金法の趣旨に基づいて日本と海外との文化知的交流の促進、文化交流を通じた日本の外交環境の整備を主なミッションとしています。具体的な事業として、海外における、日本美術展の開催や舞台芸術分野での国際共同政策の推進、そして、世界で、日本語を学んでいる方が、大体今400万人ぐらいおられるんですけれども、こういった学習者を支援し拡大するための日本語教育専門家の派遣、あるいは海外日本語講師の招聘研修などを行っています。本日の講演会はこれら文化芸術交流と海外日本語普及に続く第3番目の国際交流基金の事業の柱である日本研究知的交流分野のプログラムの一つとして実施させていただくものです。日本にとって死活的な利益が関わる同盟国であるアメリカとの知的交流、そして日本における対米理解の促進という観点からロナルド・レーガン、そしてジョージ・ W. ブッシュの両政権において米国の中東政策、そして国家安全保障政策の全体に深く関与されたエリオット・エイブラムス氏のお話を伺うべく企画したものです。ごご承知のとおり、米国社会はさまざまなエスニック集団によって構成されていますが、国際交流基金日米センターでは多様な米国社会文化の理解を進めるため、例えばヒスパニック系でありますとか日系米国人をはじめとして各種エスニックコミュニティとその中の代表的な非営利団体との連携を進めています。本日の講演会はそうした米国エスニック団体の一つである米国ユダヤ人協会アメリカン・ジューイッシュコミッティと日米センターとの共同事業でユダヤ系アメリカ知識人の代表的なお一人であるエイブラムス氏に過去の政権でのご経験を踏まえ現在最もホットな話題である米国大統領選挙あるいは今後の米国の外交政策について知見をご披露いただこう。そしてそのお話をベースに日本側のゲスト村田晃嗣同志社大学教授阿川尚之同志社大学特別客員教授との対話提談をお願いしようとそういう趣旨で実施するものです。エイブラムス氏は今回が3回目約20年ぶりの来日となりますが氏が日本で公開の講演会に立たれるのはこの京都同志社大学での講演が初めてとなります。日本で本格的なユダヤ研究ジューシュスタディーズが行われている数少ない学術拠点であるこの同志社大学においてエイブラムス氏が最初の講演会を実施されること、これ非常にシンボリックな意味があると考えます。本講演会の開催にご尽力いただいた 同志社大学市民外交研究センター、一神教研究センター、このご関係の皆様に厚く御礼を申し上げる次第です。それではここで共催者である米国ユダヤ人協会アメリカン・ジューシュコミッティを代表して同協会アジア太平洋インスティテュートディレクターのシーラ・ローエンバーグさんにご挨拶をいただきたく存じます。So Sheila, could you come to the podium?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'd like to thank Doshisha University for hosting this lecture. It's our great pleasure to be working in collaboration with the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for the last 2 years, and a special pleasure to bring Elliot Abrams to Japan on this speaking engagement this afternoon. AJC is an independent American organization that works to strengthen ties between the United States and the nations of the world. I'm the director of the Asia Pacific Institute, so my institute's focus, of course, is the countries of the Asia Pacific region, including Japan. We also work to increase the understanding between the Jewish people and the people of the world. And AJC also works to improve and strengthen relations with the State of Israel, which is so important to the Jewish people. AJC is a nonpartisan organization, which means that we do not endorse any political party or candidate. What we do is endorse or oppose or support policies. So again, thank you to Doshisha University, thank you to our partners, and to all of you. I'm sure that you'll enjoy and learn from this afternoon's discussion.
シーラさん、どうもありがとうございました。それでは早速エイブラムスさんにご講演をお願いしたいと思います。エイブラムスさんのご略歴についてはもうすでにお手元に資料があると思いますので、詳しくは語りませんが、レーガン政権の時に、史上最年少だと思いますけど32歳で、国務次官補になられました。その後ジョージ・ W ・ブッシュの政権ではNSC、国家安全保障担当の大統領の、次席補佐官として米国の中東政策全体を、見られた経歴の方です。現在のそのカウンシル・オン・フォーリン・リレーションズという、米国の中の最も有名なシンクタンクの一つである、機関において、特に中東の関係、イランあるいはトルコと中東の関係と、米国の外交政策について、研究そして、論文等の執筆をされております。著作も4冊の本がある。米国の中でも非常に知られた知識人の方です。それではエイブラムスさんにご講演をお願いしますが、エイブラムスさんには約35分から40分程度ご講演をいただいて、そのお話の終了後ディスカッサントとして村田浩二先生をお迎えし、また阿川尚之先生に全体のモデレーションをお願いしてエイブラムス氏との定談に移りたいと思います。それではエリオットさん、ご講演をお願いします。それでは皆様拍手でお迎えください。カウンスル・オン・フォーリン・リレーションズシニアフェロー、Mr. エリオット・エイブラムス。
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. And I want to express my appreciation to the Japan Foundation and to the American Jewish Committee for bringing me here. And I will take off my coat. Return to the Middle East. Today is July 20th. In about 2 weeks, on August 2nd, we will mark the 26th anniversary of the day in 1990 when 100,000 Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait. As we meet here in Asia, it's a good moment to reflect on that event and the American reaction to it and what that meant for American foreign policy, and to reflect on American policy toward Asia and the world in the next quarter century. I doubt that many Americans thought 26 years ago that the country would thereafter be ensnared in the politics of the Middle East in a way that it had never been before. The United States had previously fought all of its major wars in Europe and here in Asia. But since that day, it has been the Middle East where crises have most demanded American leadership and American military commitments. As the analyst Vance Serchuk has written, while challenges elsewhere would compete for Washington's attention in the years after Desert Storm, including the disintegration of Yugoslavia, periodic tensions with North Korea, the rise of China, it has been the problems of the Middle East that, rightfully or not, have dominated the U.S. diplomatic and security agenda during this period. It's a bit hard to recall this fact, but prior to that day in 1990, the United States had not been much involved in the Middle East militarily. The British had pulled back from the region, and the United States had steadily emerged as the replacement to British imperial hegemony. But it wasn't until the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that the Carter administration established a joint military task force for the Middle East, an arrangement that would grow into the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM. 26 years ago, then, we began to see the United States pivot from Asia to the Middle East. Soldiers and sailors, machines, bases, headquarters, expenditures, and new alliances followed. As Mr. Serchuk wrote, the American military marched into the Gulf in late 1990 to evict the Iraqis from Kuwait, and it has never really left. There can be little doubt that President Obama decided it was time to leave, and he campaigned and won office on that policy idea in 2008. His policy had been to end the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or rather to end the American role in them, and famously then pivot to Asia. Of course, that pivot to Asia is not, so far, a very impressive thing to behold. For one thing, how can one pivot forcefully when American military budgets keep declining? The forces available are fewer. For another, the pivot to Asia has been delayed by the rise of jihadism, principally ISIS, the Islamic State, and the obvious need to combat it. I would suggest that the pivot to Asia is, in any event, a minor theme in Obama policy. The major theme has been to diminish American commitments overseas and to remake America's role. That role was viewed by Mr. Obama as wrong in two ways. It was too large, thus spending money that he wanted to spend at home. Nation building here at home, he called it in 2012. And as he saw it, the traditional American role was not sufficiently progressive. Over the years, he thought, the United States had overthrown progressive regimes, had acted aggressively, had been on the wrong side of history. This he would change. The U.S. would now extend a hand, in Obama's words, to enemies such as Cuba and Iran, and he has done so. He has also apologized for past U.S. actions in Iran and in Cuba and elsewhere. American foreign policy has done less rather than more under Obama. Less in Afghanistan and Iraq, less in Syria, less in confronting Putin or in confronting China. Less, that is, than his predecessor, George W. Bush, did. But that should not come as a surprise. American foreign policy has often swung this way. We saw this after the First World War, with the defeat of the League of Nations Treaty by the United States Senate, and a general policy of staying out of another European war. We certainly saw this during the Cold War. My colleague at the Council on Foreign Relations, Steve Sestanovich, details it all in a very good book, a book called Maximalist. As he described it, American foreign policy has swung like a pendulum, from doing too much to doing too little. Maximalists, and he lists Truman, Kennedy, Reagan, George W. Bush, have wanted a big package of countermeasures against threats. Retrenchers, and he lists Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Obama, have set out to shift responsibilities to friends and allies, to explore accommodation with adversaries, to narrow commitments, and to reduce costs. In his view, the U.S. nearly always swings too far, and then the public becomes restive and unhappy. And events and public opinion combine to push the pendulum back. If we do too little, dangers grow visibly and produce a reaction. We must do more. Perhaps there's an overreaction, and a few years later, the pendulum swings again. We must pull back. Of course, for those watching outside the United States, this can become a bit disorienting. Perhaps dizziness or even nausea can result. In my view, we have reached the end of one swing of that pendulum now with Mr. Obama's policies and the cuts in defense spending reached under him, of course, with the consent of Congress, which controls the national budget. I believe the decline in military spending has come to an end, and we will see it increase under the next president, whoever that is, Trump or Clinton. And the latest public opinion polls by the Pew Center found this. Public support for increased defense spending has climbed to the highest levels since a month after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Now, as you know, a big increase in military spending began under President Reagan, after the declines under President Carter. Everyone knows that, but it is not true. The rise in military spending began under Carter in 1979 and 1980, before Reagan became president in 1981, and after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and several other events in 1979, the fall of the Shah of Iran, 1979, the Sandinista takeover of Nicaragua, 1979, for example. The Reagan military buildup, as we call it, began well before Reagan entered office and represents a swing of the pendulum of the sort Professor Sestanovich describes. We're beginning to see this now. while Mr. Obama is still in office, and we'll see more of it under his successor. We'll also, I believe, see a more aggressive policy in the Middle East against the Islamic State. Again, it has already begun in this last year of the Obama presidency from a president who resisted it for several years. Mr. Obama drew a red line against the use of chemical weapons in Syria in 2012, and then backed away from enforcing it in 2013 when President Assad used sarin gas against his own people. Obama rejected the advice in 2012 of his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and his Secretary of Defense and his CIA director to take a larger hand in Syria. But now we see more Americans on the ground in Iraq. We see America using Turkish air bases to bomb the Islamic State. Mr. Obama likes to say he ended the American war in Iraq. But there are over 5,000 American troops in Iraq, and the number is rising. And most recently, Mr. Obama acknowledged he could not further reduce the American military presence in Afghanistan, as he had hoped to do. Mr. Obama's successor will continue these actions because American security demands this. And so does American leadership. That is, the spread of the Islamic State across more territory, the establishment of such a state in greater parts of Syria or Iraq, threatening Jordan and Israel and Saudi Arabia, is not tolerable. And so the United States will become more involved in organizing and leading efforts to stop this expansion and destroy the Islamic State. Here, a lesson has been learned once again, the need for American leadership. In a way, the Obama years have been an experiment in withholding that leadership. And the results are not satisfactory. Not in Iraq and Syria, not in Ukraine or all of Europe, nor here in Asia, nor anywhere else. When I speak to officials in countries that see a national security threat, Jordan and Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia confronting the Islamic State and Iran, or Poland and the Czech Republic and the Baltic nations confronting Putin's Russia, Vietnam and Taiwan and South Korea and the Philippines and Japan confronting China. I hear pretty much the same concerns. Will the United States be strong enough and willing enough to play the role it has played since 1945? In my view, the answer is yes, regardless of the outcome of this year's election. I believe both Trump and Clinton understand the role of American leadership, of keeping commitments and of remaining strong. Such differences as there are, and there are differences, will be magnified by the heat of political competition, but we must always look beyond election rhetoric. I must admit, I cannot fully predict the policies Mr. Trump would follow. He has not said very much about foreign affairs. And some things he says contradict other things. And it is entirely unclear who would fill the top foreign policy jobs. But he has campaigned on making America great again, not on making it weaker. And let us be candid about the effect of terrorism. In recent years, we've seen terrible attacks in Brussels and Paris, Istanbul, by the Islamic State. individuals motivated by extremist versions of Islam have attacked repeatedly in the United States. The most recent attack in Orlando, Florida, killed 49 people. Even if Americans wished to do less in the world, to disengage, they realize they cannot do so in the face of Islamic terrorism that is partly aimed at the United States. They know that if the terrorist groups become stronger, they will become better armed and better trained, and will sooner or later attack the United States as they have in Europe. The terrorism of the Islamic State is a powerful antidote to isolationism. Of course, many questions are then raised. We know there is a relationship between repression and terrorism. Terrorist groups do not tend to grow in liberal democracies. We know that terrorist groups develop faster when they can find ungoverned spaces to inhabit and rule, the way Islamic State grew in Western Iraq and Eastern Syria once government control in those areas broke down. This raises many issues for us. Must we try to turn every country in the world into a democracy? Must we use force to close off every example of ungoverned space? That would be an impossible burden for the United States to carry. But we also know we cannot turn away and isolate ourselves from these problems because they will reach out and strike us sooner or later. So there will be no American return to isolationism. Americans are aware of the threat that terrorism poses to all of us. The need to fight terrorism does not, however, answer questions about economic leadership toward a more open world trading system. Here, I must admit to some greater worry because, as you know, one of the two presidential candidates, Mr. Trump, has spoken critically of such agreements. On several aspects of his analysis, I think he is wrong. He has often blamed globalization and trade agreements, trade treaties, for costing American jobs. But I think more often it is automation and modernization that have been responsible. For example, in the steel industry. The move from an industrial to a service economy began in the United States in the 1940s, long before the modern trade agreement was invented. Still, there is a point here that is not silly. There are winners and losers from globalization. When we say that a trade treaty may bring a net increase in jobs, that means there will be more gains than losses. But what about those who lose their jobs? Those are human beings with families. And it is easier to say, oh, they will be retrained. They will find new jobs. It is easier to say that than to make it happen. It cannot be a coincidence that the areas of Britain that voted most heavily for leaving the European Union were the old industrial areas that had faced the greatest job losses. I do think Trump's remarks are sometimes made to seem even worse than they really are. Consider the Wall Street Journal's comments on his economic policy speech made in late June. The headline was, Trump rolls back the protectionism. And the story said, previously, Mr. Trump had threatened to slap double-digit across-the-board tariffs on China, Japan, and Mexico over what he considers to be their unfair trade practices. But his speech contained more restrained warnings to China and other U.S. trading partners, including specific presidential authority to impose tariffs and previous examples of duties imposed on trading partners going back to the Reagan administration. Yet many of the steps he vowed to take as president are already routine under the current administration, which has brought a dozen cases against China at the World Trade Organization. In fact, just before Mr. Trump spoke, the Commerce Department announced preliminary duties on Chinese truck and bus tires due to alleged government subsidies. Such an approach is not extreme. Similarly, Trump favors bilateral trade agreements, limited pacts between two nations, rather than multilateral agreements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This view may be wrong, but it is not unique. And Trump has, for example, recently called for a new bilateral trade agreement between the United States and Britain. Still, his overall approach would be extremely disruptive to trade and economic relations. I believe part of the reason for the popularity of his approach is that there has been weak economic growth in the United States during the Obama years. The weakest recovery from a recession ever. Not once in the Obama years have we reached 3% growth. And the average for his 8 years is closer to 1.5%. Many Americans feel economic pressure, and Trump offers them an analysis for their troubles and a solution to them. I believe his analysis and his solution are wrong, and that the answer is economic growth. If we can begin faster growth, the support for his approach to international trade will diminish. Now, when we speak about American foreign policy and American leadership, I think we must ask two central questions. Is America strong enough, and is it willing to bear the burden of global leadership in the coming decades? I think the answer to both questions is yes. Let us look at public opinion for a moment. Recent polls by the Pew Center, a leading opinion research organization, found that 46% of Americans believe the United States was playing a less important and less powerful role in the world than a decade before. And they didn't like it. They didn't like it. In 2015 polls, more and more Americans said the world is more dangerous now, 65%, and more said the United States was doing too little to help solve world problems. Concern about Russia rises in every poll. 50% of Americans see China as a major threat to the United States. And that's true of Republicans and Democrats and independents. In a 2014 poll, 54% of Americans said the Obama approach to world affairs was not tough enough, against 36% saying it was about right. Since 2009, so that's 7 years, there has been an 11-point decline in the number of Americans who say we should go our own way in international matters without worrying about other countries too much. A majority of Americans support policies maintaining America's status as the only military superpower. So as I suggested earlier, it seems that the pendulum is swinging again. Fatigue with war casualties and costs, no doubt peaked around the end of the previous decade and helps explain the victory of Mr. Obama in 2008. But now there's a growing concern about a lack of leadership and more support for returning to the kinds of roles that Mr. Obama has spurned. The Gallup poll last year found this: it doesn't matter how much good news the U.S. economy has had, many Americans just aren't satisfied. A solid half of all citizens told Gallup they think it is important for the United States to be the world's largest economy. And while that's only a slim majority, 49% say it's not important. It's the highest in more than 20 years. The highest percentage of Americans in more than 20 years saying it's important for the United States to be the world's largest economy. So you see the trend. Americans like to be first, and more are unhappy when they perceive challenges to that status. But can the United States maintain that position? I think the United States is actually more favorably positioned than any rival. Consider this. The United States attracts 1 million immigrants a year, far more than any other country. And many of them are the best and brightest young people from places like India and China. They add vibrancy and initiative to our economy. They bring extraordinary intellectual and scientific assets. And, by the way, financial assets. No other country benefits by such a large brain gain. Joseph Nye, the Harvard professor and a former government official, recently said this. A few years before his recent death, Professor Nye wrote, I asked Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore and an astute observer of both the United States and China, whether he thought China would overtake the United States as the leading power of the 21st century. He said no, because the United States is able to recreate itself by attracting the best and brightest from the rest of the world and melding them into a diverse culture and creativity. China has 1.3 billion people at that time, 1.3 billion people to recruit from domestically. But in his view, Lee Kuan Yew's view, its Sinocentric culture makes it less creative than the United States, which can draw upon a talent pool of 7 billion people, obviously all around the world. Immigration affects demography, as does the birth rate. Most developed countries, including Japan, can expect to experience a shortage of people as this century progresses. Whereas the United States Census Bureau projects that between 2010 and 2050, the American population will grow by 42%, up to 439 million. According to United Nations demographers, today's top-ranking states in terms of population are China, India, the United States. By 2050, they project the order will be India, China, and the United States. Let me stay on China for a moment, because it is the great rising power thought likely to replace the United States as a global leader. Due to its one-child policy in the past century, China's population will age and actually shrink. As many Chinese say, they fear that their country will become old before they become rich. The demographer Nicholas Eberstadt put it this way. China today faces staggering demographic problems, including a shrinking pool of working-age men and women and a rapidly aging population that will slow economic growth, perhaps severely. The traditional family structure will be tested by, among other things, a growing army of unmarriageable men, a consequence of the rampant sex-selective abortion of the one-child era. China has 650 million people in the often impoverished countryside. They have a GDP per capita of $6,100, which is 87th in the world, and which is barely 12% of the American GDP per capita. China's debt to GDP ratio has risen from 150% to 260% in less than 10 years. And the debt of state-owned enterprises is rising especially fast. Government funds are propping up the stock market. And there is very serious capital flight out of China. Corruption is endemic. And it is difficult to root out due to one-party communist rule. massive air and water pollution problems will take vast expenditures to end. Contrasts of poverty and wealth are grotesque and will, as likely as not, produce political and social problems and even upheavals. Meanwhile, the United States remains the greatest target of foreign direct investment at about $180 billion per year. Our military spending, even at today's reduced levels, is far larger than that of any other country, about $600 billion a year. Moreover, the United States is part of a global system of alliances. Some are formal, like NATO or the US-Japan Defense Treaty. Some are informal. Contrast China, whose only real ally is North Korea. And then there's energy. Has there been a geopolitical change that's more striking in the last decade than the return of the United States to the position of leading energy producer? The United States produced 5 million barrels of oil a day in 2005. Last year, 9 million barrels a day. In 2009, the United States became the world's largest producer of natural gas, exceeding Russia. So today, the United States remains the world's top producer of hydrocarbons. Will the United States, in the coming years, turn toward isolationism? We cannot. Americans were reminded of this fact in 2014 by the beheadings of 3 of our fellow citizens. It had a profound effect on public opinion. As I hope I've persuaded you, isolationism is not widespread in the United States today. On the contrary, the desire for American leadership and strength are strong and arguably growing. So you may ask, well then, explain the strength of Sanders and Trump, the Sanders and Trump campaigns this year. Why did these assaults on the establishment in both parties do so well? Americans, of course, are asking this as well and have many answers, but I will give you my answer. First, economic growth. I noted economic growth has been poor since 2008. Many Americans blame either the financial and economic elites in the United States, or they blame trade treaties and imports from China and elsewhere, or they blame both. Sanders voters tended to blame Wall Street and big banks. Trump voters tended to blame foreign trade. Both groups also blame Washington, by which they mean politicians in the Capitol who are out of touch with the rest of the country and look out for their own interests rather than those of average Americans. So this anger based in economic troubles is, I think, one explanation for the successes that Sanders and Trump have had. There's another factor that's harder to explain. It is summed up in the phrase political correctness. That phrase is also hard to explain. There has been a powerful campaign in the United States, especially under President Obama, to change our culture in many ways. One example, permitting homosexual marriage and prosecuting individuals who refuse to cooperate with a homosexual marriage. Prosecuting a baker who refuses to make a wedding cake, or a photographer who refuses to take pictures at a homosexual marriage. Another example is this current push to allow transgender individuals to decide what gender they are and then go to the bathroom or locker room they feel is appropriate. Many Americans object to those changes, especially on religious grounds. There are more and more policies that reserve positions in universities for certain minorities, which of course harms those who are not in those minority groups. Many Americans feel this is unfair and violates basic American principles of treating all citizens equally. There is a push to punish police who come into confrontation with youths from certain minorities. And this has led to a decline in the willingness of police to patrol actively. In many colleges, people who disagree with these developments are sometimes shouted down or called names or even punished for their attitudes. And all of this has made many Americans angry because they feel their traditional attitudes and cultures are being attacked and delegitimized. When they speak out, they are called bigots. Many of the traditional beliefs their parents taught them are called prejudice. So how do they react? Most do not speak out publicly or engage in politics. Instead, their resentment leads them to vote for Trump, who attacks political correctness. Remember, his slogan is "Make America Great Again." Again, make America great again, meaning America was great and should return to those old values. Trump is an individual. He does not lead a great movement. If he is not elected, there will be no successor to take over from him. His impact will be felt in American politics and in some ways can have a positive effect. It would be positive if Republican Party leaders and all political leaders recognized how many Americans are feeling economic distress and how many resent the culture war being conducted against traditional values that many Americans share. The economic and cultural issues do share one key aspect. They are complaints against elites and elitism. Many Americans have lost confidence in our political and economic elites, whom they feel look down on them as backward or prejudiced, while also following policies that benefit the elites rather than average Americans. Leaders in both parties should heed this warning and try hard in the coming years to regain the trust of millions of Americans who today have lost confidence in them. I believe this will happen, and that both Trump and Clinton are better attuned to these issues than Obama has been. There are numerous other challenges the United States faces. Budget deficits that are too large, defense budgets still too small, problems in race relations, a prison system that's too large, an educational system that is superb at the top but mediocre at the bottom and in the middle, gridlock in many forms in Washington. I have not discussed all of them because I do not find, as I travel, very many people saying, oh, everything in the United States is perfect and wonderful. I find instead some deep misunderstandings of what Americans think about their country's role in the world and of the assets the United States holds. Konrad Adenauer, the great Chancellor of Germany after the Second World War, once said, "The definition of history is the sum total of things that could have been avoided." Many errors, including many American errors, could have been avoided in the past few decades and the past few years. We cannot guarantee against policy errors in the future. But I believe that despite its challenges, you will see a United States that continues to be economically and militarily strong, that continues to be a powerful and engaged ally, and continues to defend the international order that has provided all of us decades of growing prosperity. Thank you very much.
エイブラムスさん、どうもありがとうございました。それではこれからの第2部の対談に入ります前に、このステージを少し片付けて整理をして対談用のセッティングしますので、今しばらくお待ちください。はい、それでは用意が整ったようですので、第2部の対談の方に移りたいと思います。ここからは阿川先生、村田浩二先生をモデレーター、ディスカッサントにお迎えして、ただいま氏のエイブラム氏の国会に対するコメントをいただくとともに、会場の皆様からのご質問と Q&A のセッションをお任せしたいと思います。じゃあ阿川先生、村田先生、それからエリオット。ディスカッサントの村田先生、それからモデレーターをお務めいただく阿川先生、もうお二人ともご紹介の必要がないほどご高名な方々で、本日のプログラムにもご略歴を記載しておりますので私からは詳しく述べませんが、村田先生ご存知の通り、第一級の外交史家、国際政治の専門家で、前同志社大学学長です。それから阿川先生、慶応大学から同志社にこの4月にお移りになりましたけれども、アメリカの憲法学の研究の第一人者で、2000年代ですか、米国大使館で、広報担当の講師を務められたご経験をお持ちです。それではここからもうマイクをすぐにモデレーターの阿川先生にお渡ししますので、じゃあ阿川さんよろしくお願いします。
茶野さんありがとうございます。司会を務めます阿川でございます。なぜ司会が真ん中にいるのかよく分かりませんが、とにかくそういうことになっておりますので、時間もしていることですし、まず最初にですね、村田先生から今日のエイブラムス先生さんのご講演についてディスカッサントとしてですね、10分ぐらいでコメントをいただけますでしょうか。お願いいたします。
ありがとうございます。Thank you very much. My name is Murata. First of all, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Mr. Abrahams to come to our campus and provide a very powerful presentation. Because the majority of the audience today are Japanese, and we have a very able interpreters. Please allow me to speak in Japanese from now on. エイブラハムさんの今日のご講演で、26年前にイラクがクウェートに侵攻したという歴史を思い起こさせられたわけであります。で、当時、日本の対応は混乱を極めまして、日本はもちろん自衛隊を派遣することは全くできませんでしたし、最終的には合計で130億ドルをですね拠出をいたしましたけれども、そのうちに、アメリカからもその他の国々からも日本の対応はお金だけであってtoo little, too late というふうに批判をされました。そして、クウェートが解放されたときにクウェート政府はニューヨークタイムズに全面広告を出して、クウェート解放に協力してくれた国々に謝意を表したわけですけれども、その時に日本の名前は抜けていたわけであります。冷戦が終わった直後の日本外交にとっての大きな、挫折経験であったと言えます。でその後に日本は法律を整備いたしまして、1993年であったと思いますが、宮沢内閣の下で PKO 協力法を成立をさせ、そしてカンボジアに初めて自衛隊を派遣をしたわけです。しかしご記憶かどうか分かりませんが、93年に PKO 協力法ができたとき、多くのメディアはこの法律を憲法違反で、自衛隊が海外に出ることは危険な戦争の第一歩。大阪弁護士会が行ったアンケートでは、会員の 90% が PKO 法違憲と唱えたわけであります。それから20数年経って、今日本に PKO を違憲と考える人はほとんどいないわけであります。それだけ、日本人の中で安全保障や国際環境についての理解が深まったのではないかというふうに思いますし、そう期待したいというふうに思うところであります。さて、今日のエイブラハムさんのお話を伺いながら、もう時間がございませんので、大きく数点のことだけ伺いたいんですけれども、アメリカがおそらく予見しうる将来、最もパワフルな国であり続ける。おそらく 今世紀の半ばぐらいまでは十分にアメリカがThe United States as No.1 であり続けるだろうという見込みについては私もおおむね同意するところであります。で、中国が必ずしもアメリカにとって変わることはできないだろう。もちろんこれはさまざまな未来予想では、例えばゴールドマン・サックスは2025年前後に中国の GDP がアメリカの GDP を抜くというふうに言っているし、それから今の趨勢が続けば2030年ぐらいに中国の国防予算がアメリカの国防予算を抜くかもしれないというようなことが言われておりますけれども、科学技術、教育、その他総合的な国力でいうならばアメリカが21世紀の予見しうる将来ナンバーワンであり続けるであろうということに私も同意するものであります。ただアメリカが今しばらくナンバーワンであり続けるということと圧倒的にナンバーワンであるということは違うということです。で、ある意味でそういう意味ではですね、アメリカと中国との国力のギャップというものは小さくなっていくだろう。依然としてアメリカがナンバーワンであり続けたにしても中国はかなりの程度アメリカにチャレンジすることができる力をこれからつけてくるのではないかということであります。したがってただ単にアメリカがナンバーワンであるだけでなくてですね、アメリカが十分に、中国をその国際協調にいざないですね、そしてもし中国だけではありませんけれども国際的な秩序に挑戦するような国があるときにそれに対処できるだけの十分な国力とそして意思を持ち続けられるかどうかということはアメリカがナンバーワンであるというステータスとは必ずしも同じではなくてもっと大きなですね、問題ではなかろうかということが、今日のお話を伺って私が申し上げたい第1点であります。それから第2点としてこれもお話にあったようにアメリカには年間100万人もの移民が入ってくる。でまさにこのダイバーシティといいますか多様性がアメリカの活力の源になっているわけであります。ところが同時に、今日もエイブラハムさんはLGBT の問題についても若干お触れになりましたけれども、最近アメリカで、警察官が黒人を殺害し、あるいは最近は警察官が狙われるというような不幸な事件が起こっていますけれども、そのアメリカがどんどん移民を受け入れ、そして多様性を活力の源にしているということは同時にですね、そのさまざまなこの LGBT のようなジェンダーに関わるこのダイバーシティだけではなくて人種に関わるダイバーシティ、それからさらに言うならば宗教に関するダイバーシティというふうにさまざまなダイメンジョンで多様性を含んでいるわけであって、でそのことが活力であると同時にいろんなところでこの摩擦、紛争、トラブルのもとになっている。でそういうアメリカの今抱えているこの問題に正面から向き合ってですね、解決をしていかなければアメリカは大きな国力を持っていてもそれをまとめて発揮するということがなかなか難しいのではないか。で、今トランプをここまで押し立ててきた一つの背景がその人種やあるいは宗教、さらにジェンダーと、どんどんこう横に拡散していくマイノリティグループが自分たちの利益について大きな発言をするようにですね、どんどんアメリカ社会がこう横に拡散していって、でしたがってこのガバナンスが難しくなってコンセンサスビルディングが難しくなっているという、こう横に広がる変化だとするならば、サンダースをここまで押し出してきたものはどんどん縦に広がっていった貧富の格差というものがあるんではないかと。でやはりこの極端に広がってきた貧富の格差についてもアメリカがこれがトランプさんが大統領にならないようにしてもヒラリーさんが大統領にならないようにしたってこれにどう向き合っていくのかということを考えていかなければならないだろう。で私は大学で教えているのでそういうことに特に興味があるんですけれども、今全米のアメリカ全体でですね、何らかの形で大学で勉強するために、借金を抱えている人、学資ローンを抱えている人が全米で4000万人いるわけです。そしてその総額は1兆2300億ドルであります。ドルです。円ではありません。1兆2300億ドルです。これはアメリカがイラクで使った直接戦費の額を上回ります。でこういう、途方もないですね、 この教育のコスト、それが若者を逼迫している。だからヒラリーは人気がなくてサンダースは若い人たちに人気があるわけですよね。でこういう縦に広がっていく格差、横に広がっていく多様性、これに対処することを考えなければ、いかにアメリカが全体として大きな国力を持っていてもそれを十分に発揮できないのではないかというですね、そういう国内のガバナンスをどうしていくのかということについて、必ずしも今のところトランプさんもヒラリーさんも明確なビジョンのようなものを提示できていないのではないかという気がするという、その2点、つまりアメリカがナンバーワンであり続けるにしても圧倒的ではないのではないかという問題と、それからアメリカの活力の源である多様性が逆にさまざまなこの問題を引き起こしていて、あるいは縦に広がる格差があって、そういう国内問題にこれからアメリカがどう向き合おうとしているのかということが、我々同盟国の人間にしても必ずしもこう見えにくいというところに不安があるということを申し上げて、私の簡単なコメントに返させていただきます。
ありがとうございます。エイブラムさん、お答えをいただければ。
Thank you. Thank you very Yes, thank you very much for those comments. First, I certainly agree that the gap between the United States and other countries, for example, China, will diminish. It seemed to be very, very large at the end of the Cold War. This was a unique moment. But two places of disagreement, which is good. I don't think that immigration is actually related to the social tensions that you mention. Most of those are black and white tensions. They do not involve the major sources of immigration today, which are Hispanics and Asians. You don't see most of these problems with police, for example, dealing with immigrants. Hispanics and especially Asians are actually doing pretty well, rising as previous groups of immigrants were able to rise in socioeconomic status. And the second disagreement is about the gap between rich and poor. I don't think it's the gap that is the problem. I think it is the inability of the poor to rise. In 1972, George McGovern ran for president. And he had a program that would have taxed inheritance very greatly. And it was very widely unpopular. And many people were surprised because it would really only tax you heavily if you were a millionaire. Well, there aren't that many millionaires. What polls found, opinion polls found, was that people who were not millionaires thought, no, I'm not, but my son will be. He can be. This is America. So I don't think it's the gap. I don't think that, for example, we have people of immense wealth. Bill Gates, good example. Microsoft. No one is envious of his wealth. He earned it. It's just that we want the system to remain open so that the son and daughter of someone who is poor has that opportunity to rise. And if that opportunity remains, then I think the gap is not really the question.
ありがとうございます。大変なんか村田先生、それに対するコメントはあり
つまり
ますでしょうか。
最後のポイントに関して言うならば、しかしそのプアな人たちがこうリッチになってくる仕組みとかそういう社会環境というのが今のアメリカでは弱くなっているというふうにエブラハムさんも認識していらっしゃるということでよろしいんでしょうか。
いかがですか。
Well, there is, in the sense that every American state and many cities have universities that are free or nearly free for residents of that state or city. New York is a very good example. If you are a resident of New York, you can go to the University of the City of New York for free. Of course, if you want to go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, that's very expensive. Now, Sanders proposed that all university education be free. And of course, students who have loans think this is wonderful. But I think it's not fair. It is because in any society, people with university educations are the top half, or top 10%, 25%, 30%. Why should everyone else pay for those people to be able to go to the university? Going to the university means they will make more money now in the course of their lives. So they will have the opportunity to pay back some of these loans. I would not make the factory worker pay more taxes so that someone can go to the university.
ありがとうございます。こういう討論では司会が黙っているのが成功のもとだと思うんですが、私もそれほど謙虚な人間ではないので、簡単な質問を2つだけ。Let me ask you two very simple questions. Throughout your speech, I get the sense that you are overall optimistic about the future of the United States, and that you also said that the pendulum is swinging back and has begun to swing back, and whoever is going to be the next president, the pendulum is going to swing back further, given the fact that you cannot be isolationist, so forth. So now, two things. Is that going to have a very positive impact upon alliances that the United States has vis-a-vis Japan, NATO, Israel, and other countries, friendly countries, alliance or de facto alliance? Number two question is, I was intrigued by the fact that you were referring to the political correctness. And that reminded me of the Podhoretz commentator article about the Democrats turning to Reagan Democrats. At that time, it was also a pendulum swinging back, and that the people got a little tired of political incorrectness. But I get the sense that Trump is not Reagan. Reagan was very international, very open-minded, very generous. I'm not sure if Trump is that way. But what's the difference? Two questions.
I think that President Obama has not fully appreciated the value of alliances, and I do fear that Trump does not either, or does not yet fully appreciate the value of alliances. I think part of the problem is lack of information. He has made comments, for example, about the unfairness of the burden the United States carries in Asia, and the fact that Japan and South Korea are not carrying a sufficient burden. I don't agree with that, and I think it's because he does not know actually what burden Japan and South Korea and other countries, Singapore, Taiwan, are actually carrying. There are countries that I would say are not in Europe, where for a very long time, many countries diminished their defense expenditures because they said, why do we have to do this? The Americans are here. So there is some fairness in this comment in Europe, I think. My hope is that, he will learn. He will learn the facts. If he should become president, he will sit down with the generals and he will sit down with the CIA officials and he will learn what the facts are. Now, that's a hope. But I think what he has said so far suggests that he does not appreciate this, or does not appreciate it enough. Now, I worked for Ronald Reagan, and I agree with you. He is not Ronald Reagan. Because Trump speaks in terms of anger and resentment very often. And Reagan never did. Never. This was part of his greatness, really. He was able to say strong things without conveying any anger, even at people with whom he disagreed completely. Trump, if he is president, will have to learn how to do this, because you are not, after all, president of the people who voted for you. You are president of the country. Reagan was probably more skilled at conveying to the entire country that he felt he represented everyone than most presidents are. This was just a great natural talent that he had. Some political leaders have it. Most do not have it. But I certainly agree with you. But this is one of the reasons that I think, Goldwater ran in 1964, and he lost terribly badly. But there was a movement, and it grew, and Reagan developed it. So that only 16 years later, he won the election. I don't think Trump is that kind of figure who has created a movement. And if you were betting, you would bet that Clinton will win the election. The New York Times yesterday said it's 3-1. They said 76% chance Clinton, 24% chance Trump. And I think that if he loses, there will not be a movement the way the conservative movement grew from Goldwater to Reagan. I think he will just disappear.
ありがとうございます。レーガン大統領の日本のエキスパート権威であられる村田先生から。
レーガン政権にお勤めになった方を前に加えて言うことはないのですが、刺激をされてしまったものですから申し上げますと、私もレーガンとトランプは全く違うと思います。レーガンは大きな政府とか共産主義とかいう抽象的なコンセプトを批判しましたけれども、特定の集団や特定の個人を攻撃することはなかった。その点でトランプとは違ういうことが言えるだろうと思います。それからレーガンは元映画俳優だったということがしばしば言われますけれども、忘れられがちだけれども、カリフォルニアという巨大な州の州知事を8年間やっているわけであって、そういう意味でも、行政経験という点でもトランプとは全く違うだろうという点で、今の話には全く同感であります。で、エイブラハムさんにこれは質問なんですけれども、私どもこの外からアメリカの政治を見ていて、わからないことはいっぱいあるし、オバマ政権の評価というのもまだまだ定まらないと思うんですけれども、オバマの大統領としてのアチーブメントがもし、最終的にプアだという評価を受けるにしても、ある程度この議会がですね、あまりにもオバマ大統領に対して敵対的だったということもカウントしなければならないのではないかという気がします。でそれは民主党支持なのか共和党支持なのかということを別にして、今これもいろいろな世論調査を取ると、アメリカの有権者が議会に対するこの信頼度ってのは非常に低いということはですね、誰が大統領になるにしてもアメリカの民主主義を考えたときに、議会がこんなに信用されず尊敬されていない状況っていうのは深刻なんじゃないかと思うんですが、この辺の原因についてもしお考えがあれば教えていただきたいと思います。
いかがでしょうか。
It's very interesting. You are, of course, exactly right that in opinion polls, when people are asked, do you have confidence in Congress? No. Do you respect Congress? No. But everyone gets reelected. So usually it's Congress is terrible. But my congressman, oh, he's okay. He's a good guy. I think you were also right in saying that relations between Obama and Congress were especially bad. But I blame mostly Obama. He never really reached out, and many Democrats in Congress have also said this, that he never tried very hard. You know, each of us has different talents. Obama is not, I don't quite know how to put this. He doesn't like mingling in crowds. If you think of President Clinton, great contrast. If President Clinton came into this room now, he would walk up and down the aisles to say hello to everyone here, and he would love it. Even today, when he was president, or even today. How are you? Who are you? Say hello. Let's take a photograph. He loved it. Obama would never do that. And he would never do it with members of Congress either. So, you know, the kind of thing where you invite members of Congress over, let's have a dinner, let's play cards, let's have a few drinks. He didn't do that. And it may sound unimportant, but it is actually very important to build these relationships. It's important for any president.
ありがとうございます。信頼できる情報筋によると、2回ぐらい前にオバマさんが東京へ来て安倍さんとお寿司を食べたときに、お寿司めんどくさいからハンバーガーにしようよと言ったという話があります。来ておりますので、今日エイブラムスさんのお話は1990年にイラクがクウェートを侵略したところから始まってお話が続いたんですが、考えてみますと91年には日本の海上自衛隊の掃海艇が初めてマラッカ海峡を抜けて行って今日に至っているわけで、その我々が非常に今日お話を伺いながらそれぞれが考えてたのはアメリカはどこへ行くかですけれども、村田先生が最後にお求めになったように我々日本がどこへ行くのかということが我々にとっては非常に大きい問題で、それを一緒に考えることが大切かと思います。時間も過ぎましたので、これで本日のディスカッションのところは終わりたいと思います。どうもエイブラムスさんありがとうございました。村田先生ありがとうございました。
Keep safe. 阿川先生、村田先生、それからエイブラムスさん、どうもありがとうございました。それでは、本日の講演会の締めくくりとして、主催者の一員である、同志社大学一神教学祭、研究センターシスモールの所長を務めておられる篠辺淳也先生から閉会のご挨拶をいただきます。
シスモアのセンター長の篠辺と申します。3分ぐらいお時間をいただきまして、何も付け加えることはないんですけども、閉会の言葉なんですが、今回エリオットエブラ・スミスさんにお話しいただきでどうもありがとうございました。最初に IS の孤立化ということを言い、その次ですね TTP の中で私たちが勝者であり敗者であるということを、そういうふうな実感を持って言われてですね、あらゆるそのアメリカが常に優位であり続けるという、村田先生もおっしゃった楽観的な言葉をやって、その後阿川先生と村田先生と3人の中でディスカッションがありまして、でその中で私が気づいたことは、別に加える必要はないんですけども、トランプの発言をほとんど無視されているという、そういうふうなブラームさんの形でそれは取りに足らないものだというふうになったんですが、その怒りということに関してだけ注目するけれども、それ以外の口頭向けの発言というのになるんですけど、その後興味深いことは移民政策はアメリカでは成功しているということとですね、もう一つその最後にため息をつかれたように、そのアラブの春がありながらもどうしてアメリカによってですね多くの国が民主化されているけれども、一人そのアラブ諸国だけはその民主化されない、これは分析しないといけないという、そういうふうな貴重なコメントをいただきまして、非常に充実したお話を聞きまして本当にありがとうございました。はい、では最後に感謝を持って終わりの言葉としたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。
はい、篠津先生ありがとうございました。それではこれをもちまして、本日の講演会を終了させていただきます。皆様講演者のエイブラムスさん、そして、ディスカッサントの村田先生、モデレーターの阿川先生の各氏、そして本日素晴らしい通訳をしてくださった2人の同時通訳の方に、今一度大きな拍手をお送りください。はい、どうもありがとう。